They're standing in the bank with $4 million and the body of one of the bank's commanders. They get into a van and flee, but the van is blown up. They manage to hide in the forest, but the police are already on their trail. But before we find out what happens next, we need to go back a little. Before that, subscribe to the channel and write a comment saying what time you're watching this video. Now, let's get back to the story. The town of Blackwood Creek, nestled deep in the American Midwest, had always prided itself on its quiet predictability. Everyone knew everyone, and the First Blackwood Savings and Loan was the town's unwavering financial anchor. It was the early 1990s, an era before digital trails and pervasive surveillance, where cash still ruled, and a local bank felt like a vault protected by handshake, trust more than high-tech security. In the meticulously organized world of the savings and loan worked Julian Vance, a loan officer known for his crisp shirts and even crisper attitude, especially towards those he deemed unworthy of the bank service. His focus was profit, and his scorn was easily earned. Among those who had felt the sharp end of Vance's judgment were Mark Thorne and Elias Finch. They were childhood friends, both mechanics by trade, and both afflicted with a chronic, non-contagious skin condition that made public life, especially professional interaction, a constant trial. They had sought a small business loan to expand their failing garage, a plea Julian Vance had dismissed with thinly veiled disgust 6 months prior. "This is a community bank, gentlemen." Vance had sniffed, his hand delicately covering his mouth, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Your situation presents an unacceptable liability. We need customers who present well." Archive. Julian Vance internal memo excerpt, dated March 14, 1992. Recommendation: deny Thorne/Finch business loan. Rationale: image risk to the institution. Non-essential service. The memo, a chillingly brief indictment, was filed away, the foundation of a deadly resentment. The air on Wednesday, September 22, 1993, was heavy and smelled of impending rain mixed with the town's usual aroma of stale coffee and diesel. At precisely 9:47 a.m., two masked figures entered the First Blackwood Savings and Loan. They weren't sleek professionals. They wore crude ski masks and heavy, oil-stained coveralls, the familiar uniform of the local mechanics, Mark and Elias. Their movements were jerky, driven by a raw, furious desperation. Elias held an antique, pump-action shotgun, its barrel gleaming menacingly. Mark, the more outwardly aggressive, carried a canvas duffel bag. "Nobody moves, nobody talks. We want the vault now." His voice, though muffled by the mask, cracked with strain. The bank staff, trained for such an event, mostly complied, dropping to the floor. But Julian Vance, standing near the tellers, hesitated, his inherent arrogance overriding his survival instinct. Vance, instead of kneeling, took a single, fatal step towards the alarm button under his desk. "Don't be a hero, Vance," Mark yelled, taking a step forward. "You pathetic failures," Vance spat, his voice laced with the same contempt he'd shown at the loan meeting. "You think you can just—" The sudden shift from control to chaos was immediate. Elias, whose emotional tether was always thinner than Mark's, didn't aim. He simply reacted. The shotgun blast was deafening, the sound echoing off the marble floors, briefly silencing the chirping birds outside. Julian Vance collapsed silently, a dark, rapidly expanding stain blooming across his crisp white shirt. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air, replacing the diesel and coffee. Mark looked at the fallen loan officer, a small, involuntary shudder running through his frame. This was no longer just a robbery. It was a murder, a bitter, visceral execution of a personal score. For $1 million, the day's armored car drop was suddenly a secondary concern. Transcript, audio recording fragment, bank security tape, recovered 10:01 a.m. Sound of metallic click, heavy breathing. Mark, muffled, you didn't have to. Oh, look at him. Elias low. Strained, he deserved it. He always deserved it. Get the bags. Now. Sound of tearing paper and shuffling cash. They forced the remaining manager to open the vault, stuffing the cash, mostly older, unmarked bills, into the duffel bags. In less than 8 minutes, the two figures were gone, shoving their haul into a battered, tan-colored panel van parked inconspicuously 2 blocks away on Maple Street, a side street well out of sight of the bank's main windows. The van was Mark's old work vehicle, a familiar sight in Blackwood Creek. The pursuit began almost instantly as the bank manager hit the silent alarm moments after they fled. State trooper units were scrambled. Within minutes, the van was spotted heading north out of town toward the remote wilderness near the Blackwood National Forest. But before the police could close in, a tremendous explosion ripped through the air. The van, still moving at speed, erupted in a fireball, veering violently off the road and slamming into a stand of old oak trees. When the first patrol car arrived at 10:15 a.m., the van was a skeletal wreck, the interior a scorched ruin, the heat radiating out in thick waves. The back doors were blown off, the engine block split. No bodies were visible inside the wreckage. The $4 million, however, were also gone. A cursory search revealed a large, muddy track leading away from the crash site and into the thick brush, a subtle, almost swallowed trail in the moist earth. The official narrative was swiftly formed. The bank robbers had been transporting an explosive, perhaps a clumsy attempt to open a secure drop box, which detonated prematurely. The blast had destroyed all evidence, and the robbers were presumed obliterated, vaporized by the intense heat and fire. The case was assigned to Detective Sergeant Alastair Finch, no relation to Elias, a career officer whose methodical approach was now dulled by 2 decades of small-town crime. He worked alongside a fresh-faced, eager to prove himself rookie, Officer Sarah Jennings. "Looks like a clean end, Sergeant," Jennings stated, examining the site. They bought their own ticket out. Finch, a man who trusted paperwork more than gut feelings, wasn't convinced. He slowly circled the wreckage, kicking through the charred remnants. "For $1 million, Jennings. That's a lot of paper to just vaporize. We've got almost no residual debris. And why the explosion after they had the money?" The official report, written within 48 hours, closed the case with the finding: Case 93-401, solved. Suspects Mark Thorne and Elias Finch, confirmed deceased in the explosive destruction of their getaway vehicle. Stolen funds, for $1 million, presumed destroyed. Blackwood Creek breathed a sigh of collective relief. Justice, albeit grim, had been served. Julian Vance was mourned as a local hero who died attempting to save the bank's assets. The case files were archived, gathering dust in the small police station's basement. 10 years passed. The initial shock faded into local lore. The Blackwood Creek Heist, a cautionary tale. Then, in the summer of 2003, as Officer Jennings, now Detective Jennings, was clearing out the old evidence room for a renovation, she stumbled upon a small, unmarked box labeled simply, Vance J. Personal Effects. It had been forgotten in the haste of the original investigation. Inside, amidst a wallet and a tarnished wedding ring, was a crumpled, unsent letter, its paper thin and sticky with a residue that smelled faintly of cheap gasoline. It was addressed to an MT, Mark Thorne, and the script was Julian Vance's tight, arrogant hand. The letter wasn't a warning or a threat, but a cryptic, taunting note. "You should have taken the deal. Your little problem is not a liability. It's an opportunity. The real money isn't in loans. Meet me at the usual, 9 a.m. Bring a gas card." The implication was staggering. Vance and the two robbers had a pre-existing relationship beyond the denied loan. An opportunity, a deal, and the explosion, presumed an accident, was timed perfectly to eliminate witnesses and cover a prearranged exit. If Vance was planning a deal, his death was not an accident. It was a betrayal. It meant Thorne and Finch were likely not only alive, but that Julian Vance himself was involved in something far darker than small-town loans. And the note mentioned a gas card. Detective Jennings stared at the note, the dust motes dancing in the beam of her flashlight. The $4 million was never found. The bodies were never found. The van's destruction was too clean. If you want to know what the note truly meant and what the investigation uncovered a decade later, you'll need to stay tuned. If you want to know what was found next, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Detective Sarah Jennings, 10 years older and significantly less naive, traced the faded, gas-stained ink of Julian Vance's note. The official file, case 93 to 401, lay open on her desk, the cover thick with dust. Sergeant Alastair Finch, nearing retirement and now battling cynicism instead of just exhaustion, watched her silently. They weren't just angry, Alastair. They were hired, or they were partners, Jennings stated, pushing the note across the desk. Vance didn't treat anyone with enough respect to plan a heist with them, unless they had leverage, or they were the perfect fall guys. Finch picked up the archived transcript of the bank security tape. Presumed destroyed, he muttered, referring to the money. But the note. Bring a gas card. Why a card? They were mechanics. They could fill up an entire fleet with cash. This was the pivotal shift. The investigation moved from a simple robbery-murder to a complex conspiracy. The focus was no longer on finding bodies, but on following the faint, forgotten scent of paper. Jennings zeroed in on the detail, the gas card. In 1993, company gas cards were meticulously tracked. If Vance suggested using a specific card, it meant it was either untraceable or it belonged to someone who wouldn't notice the charge. A week of painstaking archive work, cross-referencing Vance's personal accounts with local businesses he frequently interacted with, yielded a breakthrough. Vance had a lucrative side contract with Transnorthern Haulage, a small, regional logistics company. He handled their fleet financing. Archive, Transnorthern Haulage Expense Ledger, Q3 1993, digital scan, page 78. An entry on September 22, 1993, at 10:45 a.m., less than an hour after the explosion, showed a transaction at a remote, all-night fuel stop 150 miles north of Blackwood Creek. Card 7741. Diesel, 45 gallons. Total, $56.25. The card was assigned to a long-haul truck, VIN 4FJSY. 45 gallons, 150 miles out, and $56 is the cost, Jennings calculated. That's enough fuel to get them through the mountains, and the timestamp is impossible if they were vaporized in Blackwood Creek at 10:15 a.m. Finch leaned closer, finally engaged. The bomb was just a theatrical distraction. They switched vehicles. The van explodes, everyone thinks they're dust, and they hop into a Transnorthern semi and drive out of the blast zone. The theory clicked. Thorne and Finch weren't dead. They had vanished into the endless highway network. The Transnorthern connection led Jennings and Finch to the company's owner, Ronald "Ronnie" Wexler, a man known locally for his high debts and low morals. Wexler claimed the truck with card 7741 was driven by a revolving cast of independent contractors and was parked at a different depot that day. Jennings pushed back, insisting on inspecting the specific vehicle, a heavy-duty Freightliner. When they finally located the rusty semi in a remote lot, it looked unremarkable, smelling of oil and sweat. But Jennings, recalling Mark Thorne's expertise as a mechanic, focused on an anomaly in the fuel tank area. She insisted on a deep mechanical inspection. Inside the cavity where the secondary fuel tank should have been, hidden behind a masterful, welded-in panel, they found a false compartment. It was empty now, but the residue was irrefutable. The compartment showed faint traces of plastic lining and a metallic residue consistent with old-school bank security die packs. First turning point. Thorne and Finch didn't just escape. They had a pre-planned, professionally constructed exit vehicle waiting, arranged by someone with access to heavy equipment and logistics. Wexler, likely facilitated by Vance. Vance hadn't just denied them alone. He had groomed them for a specific task. As the heat intensified on Ronnie Wexler, he disappeared. His wife, Martha Wexler, a quiet woman who had long endured her husband's shady dealings, became Jennings's emotional anchor. Ronnie was always afraid of Julian Vance. Martha confessed during a strained interview at her kitchen table, the scent of stale coffee thick in the air. Vance had something on him, something about the contracts. Ronnie didn't want to talk about it, but he called them the sick boys. He said Vance was using them. that they were desperate, and they'd do anything to get what they needed. She handed Jennings a small, yellowed photograph. It was Thorne and Finch, younger, standing proudly in front of their original small-town garage. But on the back, written in Martha's hurried script, was an address: Cabin 17, The Ridge, West Virginia. A year after the robbery, Ronnie insisted we take a vacation to this remote cabin. He was paranoid, drinking heavily. He made a call there, asking about the delivery. I wrote the address down, thinking maybe I'd sell the damn place if he kept drinking. Second turning point: an address a decade old, in a completely different state. The trail had gone cold, but now it had a destination. The journey to Cabin 17 was long and arduous. In 2003, the remote area was still sparsely mapped. When Finch and Jennings arrived, the cabin was dilapidated, semi-abandoned, but definitely not vacant. The lock was simple, and the stench inside was immediately obvious: a mix of neglect, old wood, and decay. On a cot in the corner, covered by a thin, moth-eaten blanket, lay the mummified remains of a man. His skin was discolored, but the characteristic marks of the skin condition were still faintly visible. The medical examiner confirmed the identity through dental records: Mark Thorne. Cause of death was inconclusive, but looked natural: a heart attack or stroke, perhaps exacerbated by chronic stress. He had died relatively recently, perhaps just a few months prior. In the corner, sitting on a rusted metal chair, was the other fugitive, Elias Finch. He was skeletal, barely recognizable, his eyes wide and vacant. He hadn't just been hiding. He had been failing to live. The shock of finding his dead friend and the realization of his own decade-long imprisonment had broken him. Elias Finch, after weeks of hospitalization and gradual recovery, was finally questioned. He spoke in halting, defeated whispers. The mask of bitterness had melted away, revealing only crippling fear and regret. Vance, he wanted the money out of the bank before a federal audit, Elias admitted, his voice barely a rasp. He was skimming. He knew we were desperate, and he knew no one would question our bodies in the explosion. He promised us a new life, a cure for this. He gestured vaguely at his skin. Transcript: Elias Finch interrogation tape, October 2003. Finch, Vance said the vault manager, Mr. Peterson, was going to take the heat. He didn't say anything about him being there that day. It was supposed to be empty. Vance, he must have found out Julian was double-crossing him. Jennings, who was double-crossing whom, Elias? Why was Vance in the vault area? Finch, he had a key to a separate deposit box. He said he was going to add a sweetener to the pot. We knew Mark had to disable the truck's engine, set the timer, and run. But Vance was supposed to be long gone. Elias confirmed the murder was a desperate, panicked act when Vance tried to push the alarm and hurled his final insult. He confirmed the switch to the semi-truck, driven by a burner-for-hire that Ronnie Wexler provided, long before the van exploded. When asked about the money, Elias pointed to a rough patch of earth just outside the cabin door. Mark buried it. He said he couldn't spend blood money. He just stared at it every day. For $1 million, gone to dust. Third turning point: the money was never destroyed. It was never spent. It had been the price of their miserable freedom, a symbol of their failure. Under the dirt patch, the FBI recovery team found a large, tightly sealed metal box. Inside, the $4 million was perfectly preserved, stacked, and wrapped in a plastic Vance had instructed them to use. But there was something else: a small, separate envelope. It contained a single, handwritten note from Julian Vance, folded tightly, addressed to Mark Thorne. Mark, you and Elias are the fall guys. The total haul is $12 million. You get $50,000 in a cabin. The rest is mine and Ronnie's. Enjoy the heat. Yacht foul. The explosion was timed perfectly, not just to conceal the escape of Thorne and Finch, but to ensure Vance's death was attributed to a robbery gone wrong, solidifying his heroic status and closing the book on the real, much larger theft. Vance never intended for Thorne and Finch to have a new life, only a comfortable silence while he and Wexler planned their escape. Mark and Elias, the scorned mechanics, were not just seeking revenge. They were victims of a deeper corporate betrayal. The discovery of the letter, Vance's final arrogant taunt, closed the loop. The sweetener was the rest of the missing $8 million, and Vance had intended to pin the robbery and his death on the sick boys who were already social outcasts. Thorne and Finch were used, abused, and left to rot. The arrest of Ronnie Wexler was swift. He was found 2 states over, managing a new, legitimate-looking trucking depot, living under an assumed name. Elias Finch, broken and physically failing, received a reduced sentence for cooperation. But the human cost, Vance's life, Mark Thorne's wasted decade in death, and Elias's emotional ruin, had been paid long before the money was found. What do you think? Was justice truly served for all involved? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The discovery of the hidden $4 million and Julian Vance's cruel final note sent shockwaves through Blackwood Creek. The town was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their martyr, Julian Vance, was not a hero, but the architect of the crime, a corporate predator who used human desperation as leverage. Vance's funeral, 10 years prior, was now revealed as a monument to a lie. Ronnie Wexler, found guilty of conspiracy, accessory to murder, and money laundering, was sentenced to life imprisonment. He never showed remorse, maintaining that Vance had forced his hand, a final act of rationalizing greed. Elias Finch, due to his extensive physical and psychological degradation and his full cooperation, was sentenced to 15 years with the possibility of parole. He lived out his days haunted by the scent of gasoline and gunpowder, the $4 million, the intended prize, having become his lifelong cage. For Detective Sarah Jennings, the case was career-defining but costly. She never quite shook the chill of the remote cabin or the sight of Mark Thorne's skeletal remains, realizing that the system had failed these men long before they failed the law. The money was returned to the First Blackwood Savings and Loan, providing a bitter form of closure, yet the deep wounds in the community, the loss of trust in their institutions, remained. The real cost of the vanished millions was not the dollars, but the 10 years of quiet despair endured by the men who were used as disposable collateral.